showed their strength and they showed their discontent with their votes, letting it be known that they are sick of the socialist representatives in the European Parliament, and they replaced a lot of them with politicians from the right.
This week, Steve Bannon was sentenced to prison. I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjekovic. And we are unapologetically outspoken. Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. So, Stephanie, before we dive into today's topic, which, by the way, we have so much to cover because so much shit has happened in the last few days. But before we get into it, remember how last week I said I would bet that Biden's going to find another LGBTQIA XYZ social influencer to come to the White House for another shit show pride event?
Yep.
Well, apparently he reached out to some chick named Chappelle Roan. I've never heard of her. Surprisingly, she's not transgender, but she does identify as a queer woman, and she dresses up like a drag queen for a lot of her shows. And I guess her real name is Kylie Rose Ann Stutz, but Chappelle Roan is like her self-proclaimed drag name. Well, she recently gave a performance last weekend at the Governor's Ball Music Festival in New York. And she dressed up like the Statue of Liberty with green hair and sparkly green skin. And she wore some outfit that had money on it or something, to represent a taxi. And during the performance, she talked about how she turned down Biden's request to perform at the White House. So at first I was like, oh, sweet. But why, right? Why did she turn it down? Well, apparently, despite Biden admin's repeated efforts to shove their DEI agenda down our throats, it's just not good enough for the LGBTQIA XYZ community, because Roan said the reason was, quote, as a response to the White House, who asked me to perform at Pride, we want liberty, justice, and freedom for all. When you do that, that's when I'll come, end quote.
Okay, well, is it just me, or does it feel like the Biden administration is pretty much using the LGBTQ community as a distraction, kind of like how the Romans used the Colosseum as a distraction as Rome was falling? Because it's so ridiculous, the lengths they're going to. And I don't know if it was that event or some other event where Biden was watching some show and it was so embarrassing, and Kamala was next to him dancing, and it was some LGBTQ event, and it was just ridiculous. You could tell neither one of them really wanted to be there, but they're using these people as their little props to distract us from the real problems in this country, like inflation and crime and war. But I think what you said makes a really good point, that you never win with the left. They're never happy. You give an inch and they want a mile. And when you have a party that's fueled with hate, you're never going to appease them, no matter how hard you try. So I think it's great, though, that he's getting that side of it, because it's just so perfect, since everything has to be about LGBTQ these days. But speaking of Biden oopsie moments, Tara, he has been caught again plagiarizing. So the D-Day event, where we've already said a lot about that event, I mean, very embarrassing for our president, everything that day. But I guess he gave a speech or said a few words that sounds oddly familiar to a famous Reagan speech. So I'm going to play the clip side by side with Reagan so you can just see what happened here.
Last, the hour had come. Dawn, 6th of June, 1944.
At dawn on the morning of the 6th of June, 1944,
225 American Rangers arrived by ship, jumped into the waves and stormed the beach.
225 Rangers jumped off the British landing craft and ran to the bottom of these cliffs.
Gunfire rained above them, but still, they kept coming. Nazi grenades thrown from above exploded against the cliffs, but still, they kept coming.
The Rangers looked up and saw the enemy soldiers at the edge of the cliffs shooting down at them with machine guns and throwing grenades. And the American Rangers began to climb.
They launched their ladders, the ropes, and grappling hooks, and they began to climb.
They shot rope ladders over the face of these cliffs and began to pull themselves up.
When the Nazis cut their ladders, the Rangers used the ropes. When the Nazis cut their ropes, the Rangers used their hands.
When one ranger fell, another would take his place. When one rope was cut, a ranger would grab another and begin his climb again.
And inch by inch, foot by foot, yard by yard, the Rangers literally clawed their way up this mighty precipice until at last they reached the top.
Soon, one by one, the Rangers pulled themselves over the top.
They breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and they turned in that one effort the tide of the war that began to save the world.
And in seizing the firm land at the top of these cliffs, they began to seize back the continent of Europe.
Okay, so Reagan said it way better. I wonder
And-
if Claudine Gay from Harvard wrote that.
That's what
Was that what you were gonna say? Oh my gosh, it's probably like AI. It's like AI, like find a D-Day speech, and then it like takes the speech and changes like a few words. But like, how many times at this point has Biden been caught plagiarizing? Like, I know he was actually kicked out of the presidential race like the first time he ran for plagiarizing, but yet he keeps doing it over and over again. It's so embarrassing.
Well, Stephanie, his entire career is based on lies. So what's a little plagiarism in the mix? Like, as if the man could even form a critical thought at this point, right? And if it's not AI, then clearly his speechwriters have no originality either. But I have to point out that this was not Biden's only oopsie moment this week. He has been on a roll. Like, that event you referenced earlier, I think you were talking about the Juneteenth concert that took place on Monday. He literally froze for almost a minute watching this performance. And then he mumbled a bunch of like incomprehensible nonsense. And people are starting to call it Bidenese and saying that it's elder abuse that they keep putting him on stage to speak in public. And Stephanie, I want to play this clip and I want you to tell me what Biden is saying.
She knows so long as I was denied, our freedom can never be secured.
My freedom can
Let
be
me-
secure.
Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I'm going to play it one more time, okay? Because I want you to tell me what the fuck he's saying, if I can get the damn clip back up. Once more.
She knows so long as I was denied, our freedom can never be secured.
That was pure mumble. Those were not words. And we're
No.
calling it Bidenese. I like that.
It is 100% nonsense. And then on top of this, on Monday, he's back in Europe to attend the G7 summit that we talked about earlier this week. And he met up with the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, on Thursday morning. And he gave her like this totally awkward salute. And he was the last of the G7 leaders to arrive. He literally shuffled onto the stage. And kind of like his disrespectful being 35 minutes late for the D-Day event last week, he was late for this as well. But why the fuck was he saluting her? Like, he is just so beyond embarrassing at this point. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot to talk about next week in regards to the G7 summit, since it's continuing for the next couple days. But I do want to mention this. So we talked about how Biden gave the $225 million aid package to Zelensky with his like completely ridiculous apology for the delay. Well, one of the things that the G7 is planning to agree on, supposedly in this meeting, is a $50 billion loan package to Ukraine. And where is most of the financing coming from? The United States, of course. But reportedly, France and Germany may reject Biden's proposal for Europe to be the guarantor of the loan. So there was a senior European diplomat who said, quote, "What Washington is proposing is that we, the US, take a loan, Europe takes all the risk, then Europe pays the interest, and the US uses the money for a US-Ukraine fund. We might be stupid, but we're not that stupid," end quote. So perhaps all of the G7 is not on board, and we'll see what happens with this meeting.
Good for them. I mean, to call it out like that gives me a little bit of hope. That's a good thing.
Hopefully. But speaking of money and the Biden admin, I also have to give an update on something else we talked about on Monday because this is so fucking stupid that it has to be said. So, you know how we were talking about how Buttigieg had no real answer for why $7.5 billion in taxpayer funds that back in 2021 Biden said would build these 500,000 EV stations have only resulted in like 7 charging
Yeah.
stations so far? Well, apparently the delay is due to Biden's DEI commitment because an article came out in the Daily Caller on Wednesday that said, according to documents recently obtained from the Department of Transportation, the delay in installing charging stations is due to DEI requirements because in order to qualify for federal grant funding to build these chargers, applicants have to promise to engage in intentional outreach to underserved communities by doing things like hosting neighborhood block parties or sports and cultural events or games and contests or something called visual preference surveys. And they should make sure that multilingual staff or interpreters are available during these events for community members who don't speak English. So, a senior DOT official told the Washington Free Beacon that in many cases, applicants for these federal grants have to submit reports that can be hundreds of pages long on how they plan to pursue equity in every step of the construction process. And they're encouraged to promote local inclusive economic development and entrepreneurship by using minority owned businesses and committing to finding support services to help train, place, and retain people in good paying jobs or apprenticeships, focusing on women, people of color, and others who are underrepresented in infrastructure jobs. Like, what the fuck? How about we just hire the most qualified person to do the job? Like, I'm so sick of this DEI shit.
Yeah, I watched a clip yesterday from a meeting in California with the politicians there, and apparently they were trying to pass this like reparations thing that was gonna fund like $800 billion to reparations, like some obscene amount of money. And one of the women spoke up and she was like, I'm voting no on this because number one, like the people that have to pay this would be anyone that is not, black in California, which includes Latinos, Asians. And she was talking about how she was Latino and she's like, we're not even from this country. My family immigrated here. Why should we have to pay for something that happened in this country long before we were even citizens here? And I mean, she made a really good point. And it's interesting how even like the lefty of the left California politicians are starting to speak up against this crazy, DEI stuff.
Yeah, because it's insane. And speaking of speaking up and speaking out, I want to get back to Europe and I want to talk about what happened in Europe this week with the parliamentary elections, because it seems that Americans are not the only ones who are fed up with the global agenda. And we've been talking about this for months, about all the protests that have been taking place. And they're mostly related to like unchecked immigration that's happening across Europe, inflation, high energy prices, rising crime, all the things we're experiencing in the United States, right? But unlike our congressional elections last year, where we expected the red wave that didn't happen, Europeans showed their strength and they showed their discontent with their votes, letting it be known that they are sick of the socialist representatives in the European Parliament. And they replaced a lot of them with politicians from the right. Now, this shift didn't result in like a full on right majority, and the center will continue to kind of be in control in the EU Parliament. But voters made enough waves that the Parliament is now more conservative than it has ever been in the past. And there is a record number of legislators who now lean more right, especially when it comes to Europe's top 3 economic countries, being France, Germany, and Italy, where the candidates who gained the most seats were the ones who campaigned against immigration, against support for Ukraine, and against these crazy climate change policies. So I want to talk a little bit about the results because they were especially strong in France, where the National Rally Party beat all expectations and they took 31% of the country's seats, winning the most votes to represent France in the European Parliament, which was almost double the amount of votes for the candidate that was supported by the current French president, Macron. So, like, he went into a panic and immediately announced he was dissolving France's parliament, and he called for a snap election for the National Assembly. And that's supposed to happen later this month. I think it's starting June 30th, but he gave this very Biden-like speech about the rise of nationalists and demagogues and the threat to democracy, and how it's not a danger not only for France, but for Europe and the whole world. And so he's going to let the people of France choose the future parliament. And he's banking on like fear tactics and threat of a right-wing takeover to try to sway the people of France. And he gave a press conference on Wednesday where he called on all the other parties in France to forge an alliance against the National Rally Party, and said he's doing this snap election to kind of test the truth between those who choose to strengthen their own hand, which I'm assuming he's referring to the National Rally Party, and those who choose to strengthen the hand of France, being himself. And he said if his party loses, he's not going to quit because he's acknowledging that the people are angry, but don't go with the National Rally Party because it's just a political project. And he compared them to the Nazi Party and said that Europe's history of fascism should not be allowed to recommence. Like, does this not sound exactly like what Biden says about Trump?
Yeah, and I don't get it. So they already voted and they voted right. And so then he's basically saying like, I don't like this do-over. And now they have to have a snap election. Is that what it's?
The snap election is just for the country of France. The votes were for the European Parliament, which is,
Okay.
I look at it, you can look at it like Congress, where we send representatives from the different states to Congress.
Okay.
It's the European Parliament is like a Congress for Europe. So it's not affecting what's happening specifically in France. And Macron isn't even up, like the next election in France isn't until 2027. So this isn't going to influence him. He's not going anywhere. But it's a gamble on shifting the country's politics because his party is currently in power in France. And by doing this snap election, they could end up losing more power with people who are voting for members of the actual country's parliament that are more in line with the National Rally Party. And from what I understand, he's like the most unpopular president in French history. People are upset about all the shit happening in France, like exactly what's happening in the United States with this massive immigration and rising crime. And there have been a shit ton of like protests and unrest throughout the country. So I think if the results show a shift towards his party, like the way I think if people vote for Biden, he gets all these votes, it's going to be a clear sign of election fraud because the people are obviously unhappy, and they showed this with their vote for the European Parliament. And that's just France. So like, let's take a look at Italy real quick, because Italy currently has a conservative prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, and that ruling party won the most votes. But what's interesting is that they won by 29%, which is quadruple of what the party's votes share was during the last European parliamentary election. So that conservative party is gaining traction in Italy as well. And Meloni's response was to say, you know, the people of Italy are telling us loud and clear that they want to continue in the direction that we're going. And then Germany made waves because their extreme right AfD party, which is the one that everyone compares to the Nazis, they took 16% of the vote to become Germany's second largest EU faction party. And what's even more telling is that the party of the current German chancellor, Olaf Scholz, that's the Social Democrats Party, they've been ruling for over 5 decades, and they came in with less than 14% of the votes. And I was reading an article in CBS News that talked about how this was the absolute worst result that the Social Democrat Party has had in a national referendum in more than 100 years. And it's calling into question whether Olaf's coalition government can even survive. So in the context of the fact that, you know, the parliament is kind of like a Congress, is this important because it's not resulting in immediate change in Europe? But yes, it's absolutely fucking important because it's showing that there is a shift in Europeans rejecting the ruling elites and their socialist policies, and they're pushing back on the globalist agenda. And the Daily Signal did an interview with Niall Gardner. He's the director for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. And he was asked what he thought this meant for the United States. And he basically said the fact that like millions of voters in Europe are rejecting this far left woke ideology that the elites have been pushing in Europe for the last couple decades is a clear sign and a bad sign for the Biden admin because European voters have the same issues and the same concerns that we do. They want stronger borders, they want to restore national sovereignty, and they want a government that's more culturally conservative. And he said that he thinks Biden's advisors are probably nervous and that they should be concerned because whatever happens in Europe will have an impact on the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to see these same issues being felt in Europe that we're feeling here, like not wanting war, not wanting a migrant crisis, which a lot of people don't realize they're dealing with that just as bad over there, and not wanting crime. So, I mean, it really opened my eyes when reading all of this that it's not just a Biden issue. It is like the global elites that are pulling the puppet strings everywhere. And just look at how many protests have happened in France, Germany, Ireland, the UK. Like they've literally thrown shit at Parliament. And I mean, I guess I didn't realize just how right everyone has shifted in the country. But I hope that that's the case here come November. And you mentioned their fear tactics, calling the right Nazis and fascists, just like they do here in the US. But like the gig is up. We know who the true fascists are. And I want to just read the Wikipedia definition of fascism because it literally sounds like I'm reading the left playbook. So it says, quote, fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader. I don't even know if I said that right. Centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation or race, and strong regimentation of society and the economy. Okay, so centralized autocracy, aka the global elites, militarism, aka the military industrial complex, subordination of individual interests for the perceived good of the nation, that literally describes what's happening with the whole like LGBTQIA trans agenda, where we're all having to shift for the good of like the 1% or whatever. Belief in a social hierarchy. We'll look at how they place everyone in a hierarchy based on your oppression points, how much you've been oppressed. And then you have like white males that are basically treated like dirt because they don't have as many oppression points. So like literally every step of this is the left's playbook. And we already know whatever they accuse the right of doing, they're actually doing on the left. So we don't want this social hierarchy and division based on race, gender, and sexual orientation. But this is what the Biden administration is pushing, and it sounds like most of Europe. And I think that that's another reason they don't want us going on like TikTok and social media, because we see these protests, we see the viewpoints of people around the world, and they're afraid we're all going to unite. So they're the true fascists. They are the ones that are intolerant of any opinion that varies from theirs. And, you know, it's like, again, they say that they're not racist, but the right is. Yet when you have like a Black person or a Latino or an Asian person that disagrees with them, they will like publicly take them down, ruin their life, and make racial slurs against them. They say like they're for the LGBTQ community. Yet, if someone disagrees or tries to detransition, they're shunned from the community. Just look at like Chloe Cole and all the people we talk about on this podcast. They say they're pro women's rights, yet they are erasing the very definition of a woman. And I bring this up because I see so many young women on TikTok that think that the left is still the party for women and for rights when they're not. That's what they say, but their actions show another story. And so I think most people have finally become aware of it, at least anyone that's paying attention. And I'm glad to see people waking up across Europe. the question I have, and you alluded to, is, are they actually going to have a free and fair election? Like, why did he call a snap election unless he's not sure that they're going to rig it somehow? So that's my only thing that I wonder. But maybe he just did it out of emotion, which definitely could be. But that brings me to another topic of what's happening here in the US. So this week, Steve Bannon was sentenced to prison starting July 1st, I believe, and he'll be there until after the election for a misdemeanor, Tara, a fucking misdemeanor.
Yep.
So real quick, like Steve Bannon, he worked with Trump, obviously. He also has his whole news program, War Room, which is very popular, huge ratings. So no wonder they want to shut that down, during the election season. So he went on Tucker Carlson's podcast and listed all the people on the right who are being locked up. He mentioned like they want to lock up Rudy Giuliani, who's an elderly man at this point, Peter Navarro, who is already in prison. And he really thinks that Trump is going to be sentenced to prison as well. So basically, anyone who questioned the election results in 2020, what?
Didn't he also mention some like old grandmother or something?
Yes, I'll get
That
to
like
that in a
got 2
second.
years?
There's a few of them.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few. It's sick. It is sick. There's like quite a few people that they are trying to lock up that are just innocent people. And like, look at all of the January 6th people who are still in prison. Even after the surveillance, like they released the shaman guy, but what about all the other people that are still stuck in prison for simply walking in a Capitol where the doors were wide open and the police were ushering them in? And this is like all out there now. There's video of it. So anyhow, I want to play a clip. This clip has been all over the news and social media the past day or so. And it's a leaked clip of Nancy Pelosi admitting to being the one responsible for not having the National Guard at the Capitol on January 6th. So listen to this.
Responsibility, Terry. We did not have any accountability for what was going on there, and we should have. This is ridiculous. You're going to ask me in the middle of the thing when they've already breached the inaugural stuff should we call the Capitol Police? I mean, the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient.
No, that's not a question of how they don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for war.
So at the end, she says, I take clear responsibility for not having the National Guard there.
She almost sounds as bad as Biden. Like,
yeah,
we need to get all these fucking old people out of office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, she probably didn't know what was going on because she's fucking old. But you remember like her daughter was there and they were filming the whole thing for like a documentary. Yeah. So I think that this was a clip from that, I think. But anyhow, like, according to the law, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, was the one who had the ultimate authority to bring in the National Guard. And she waited hours and hours and hours, ignoring the calls for help from the Capitol Police. Trump had pre-approved 50,000 troops. We've already been over this on the podcast. She was never questioned at all about this, not by the media, not by the January 6th committee. And now this video leaks because, like I said, she recorded everything that day for her daughter's documentary, almost like they knew that something big was going to happen that day. So they just happened to have like a whole freaking camera crew following them around. So anyhow, the video leaks, and even the most leftist network, MSNBC, is questioning her about it, finally, 4 years later. So listen to her response.
The media today. Well, because of the fact is that the president of the United States, the former president, and his toadies do not want to face the facts. They're trying to do revisionist history on January 6th. But we cannot let us be dragged into their, again, false impression of what happened that day. They know what happened that day. They know how serious it is and was and continues to have an impact on our country. And yet they want to call the people who were in there hostages.
Okay, so Tara, notice how she completely tries to shift off the topic. She doesn't deny the video. She doesn't deny her responsibility and take back that statement she said in the video. She's basically saying, nothing to see here, folks, move on. Like that's what, you know what I mean? So it's like clear what's happening here. And it's hard to move on when, again, there are still January 6ers imprisoned. Ashley Babbitt was murdered, and the officer still to this day hasn't been questioned or held accountable. And now they are imprisoning major players, like I just said, Steve Bannon, Giuliani, Peter Navarro, and maybe even Trump. And in Tucker Carlson's episode with Steve Bannon, Bannon pointed out a gold star mother, Tina Peters, is facing 20 to 30 years in prison. And then there's a 75-year-old grandmother who is in ill health that was just sentenced to 2 years in a federal penitentiary. I can't talk prison, we'll say. I can't say that word today.
Penitentiary.
I haven't had enough coffee yet. Thank you, Tara. But, you know, I mean, that is how this administration treats their citizens. That's how they treat their gold star families and their, you know, elderly citizens that were simply voicing their opinion. So do you want to know exactly what they're throwing Steve Bannon in prison for, just in case anyone didn't get the full story? The same thing that Trump aide Peter Navarro is in prison for, which is for simply claiming executive privilege in response to a subpoena by the January 6th committee, which, by the way, all of their attorneys advised them to do. Well, guess what? Do you know who else violated a congressional subpoena? Well, for one, Hunter Biden, and two, just recently, Merrick Garland. So nothing's been done about them. Are we going to throw them in prison as well? I think we should.
Well, while we're on the topic of Hunter Biden and shady shit and no accountability, let's talk about his case this week where he was found guilty on all 3 felony charges. And people are saying like, oh, this proves the left is holding him accountable. And they're comparing it to the Trump trials and they're saying like there's no bias. But this case is not even fucking remotely comparable. Like there is nothing. This is a distraction to try and convince people that we don't have a 2-tier justice system. And Mike Howell, he's the director for the Oversight Project at the Heritage Foundation. He did an interview with the Daily Signal and he put it best. So I want to play this clip.
The charges that he faced, what was your initial reaction when you learned this guilty verdict?
Yeah, not surprised whatsoever. Was born tonight, wasn't born in last night, and the fix has been in for some time here. I mean, I really worry that the propaganda media is going to play this as a both sides thing. They're going to basically say at the high level, oh my gosh, Hunter was held accountable, and that's what's happening to Trump. And then when they're categorically different things of degree and kind and implications. What's happening with Hunter is essentially they picked the lowest level thing that didn't connect to Joe, the thing they could paint in the light of addiction, the most sympathetic light, as a means to absolve him for guilt and everything else. What the American people really care about, what I care about is, you know, not that Hunter was a crackhead, not that he was a crackhead that got his dead brother's wife addicted to crack cocaine. She's the one who found the gun and got rid of it. All that's immaterial. What's material is the corruption in the federal government, that Joe Biden and his family were running an international pay-to-play influencing peddling scheme in some of the most corrupt regions of the world, to include Ukraine and the CCP, you know, our enemies in the CCP, and other corrupt regions. And what happened in this arc, starting from a year ago when we were in federal court, they were trying, the same federal court, by the way, that he just got convicted in, David Weiss, the prosecutor, same prosecutor here, tried to give Hunter a plea deal, say, you know, accept liability for the gun and tax stuff, and we'll pardon you for all this other stuff that connects back to Joe and the corruption that the American people are upset with. We sniffed that out, got it blown up, and so here they are back at the drawing board today, convicting him of the gun charge, but still no movement on the things that American people care about. And what this sets up for, not only is the misinformation that like the law is being applied evenly in this country, but for a pardon of Hunter, they picked this sympathetic thing that you can't, or you can wrap in addiction and all those things, and you cannot connect to Joe. And it sets up Joe for a pardon of Hunter, a pardon that will not only be for this charge, but for all of the things connecting not only back to Joe and his family, but to the thing I'm even more concerned about than the Bidens is the intelligence community and law enforcement who sat there and watched this corruption happening in plain sight, not only did nothing, but hid it, and then used every tool at the disposal of the awesome force of the US government and even some other governments to go after President Trump, which they're still doing today. And so this is not a both sides thing. This is corruption.
That's exactly what it is, corruption.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
technically, Hunter faces up to 25 years in prison. But what do you want to bet he's going to get off with like fucking probation, right?
Oh,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and last week, Biden mumbled that he wouldn't pardon Hunter. But yesterday or Wednesday, KJP was asked in a press conference if Biden would commute Hunter's punishment so that he wouldn't be sent to federal prison. And of course, she declined to comment and said she hasn't spoken to the president about it. So then she was pressed by a second reporter. And what did she do? She gave one of her fucking "let me be clear" comments and repeated herself. Like classic fucking no answer KJP.
Yeah, she is the worst White House press secretary, I think, in history. And guess where Joe Biden was as news of Hunter's guilty verdict came out? Like, you can't make this shit up. He was at an anti-gun event where he spoke about having more controls on obtaining guns illegally. Like, the fucking hypocrisy. It's like I've never seen anything quite as bad. And again, it's just like you said, while Hunter was found guilty, look at all of the other charges that went past the statute of limitations, like the whole tax evasion thing. They picked this small gun charge to make it look like they're doing something, and the real crimes are ignored. And like, look at the things that were found on his laptop. There were all kinds of things, including allegedly underage girls, business dealings with foreign adversaries. But now all of that, is just going to be locked away because they got him. They got him on this little tiny gun charge that he'll get a slap on the wrist for. It's ridiculous.
You know what I wonder? I wonder if because I keep thinking as more and more and more comes out about, Biden literally can't get on stage without doing something so geriatric and senile that we can't keep making excuses for it. I just in the back of my mind am wondering are they going to use Hunter's verdict as a way to somehow make Joe incapable of being president? It'll be too much for him emotionally or something, and so they'll have to take him out of the running. I just don't see how they can keep him in the race at this point. There's got to be something.
I know. I'm still waiting for it. There has to be something up their sleeve, but maybe they realize what's happening, and so they're like, well, let's go ahead and get this Hunter case, through so that he can pardon him before he leaves the White House. I don't know. But in any event, I think people see exactly what's going on, that there still is a two-tier justice system. And, I would like to see them go after Hunter and Merrick Garland for violating the congressional subpoena, just like they're doing to Steve Bannon. That would be equal treatment under the law. So that's never going to happen, but we can hope, and we'll keep everyone posted on whatever does happen with all this craziness. But yeah, that is all the crazy updates we have just for today. We'll have more in a few days. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next time. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.